Thank you for joining us here tonight, folks. We're just admitting everybody to the webinar, and the event will be getting started in just a few moments. Thank you, folks. If you're just joining us now, we're going to get started in just a minute. We're just admitting everybody to the webinar, and we'll be getting things underway right away. Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers. On behalf of the store, and with thanks to Penguin Random House Canada and McClelland and Stewart, it is an enormous pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to the virtual prairie launch of the series, What I Remember, What It Felt Like, What It Feels Like Now, by Ken Dryden. Now, we are broadcasting from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. One thing I will point out for those of you watching, imperfect automatically generated subtitles are available for this evening. They're not fantastic, but hopefully they will serve a purpose if you do need to access them. You can access those just by pressing the CC button at the bottom of your screen, and that'll bring them up for you. I'll put that information in the chat as well. Now, we are gathered here tonight again to hear about the series and hear from Ken Dryden as he celebrates the 50th anniversary of the 1972 Summit Series. We have an incredible host here tonight as well, and I'll introduce both of those folks in just a moment. Just a few quick words about what's going to go on this evening. So you'll notice there is a live chat, so please feel free to talk amongst yourselves, offer any comments you might have in that way. While tonight's featured guests may not see the chat live, I will certainly be sharing it with them afterwards, so rest assured their eyes will see it one way or another. There'll also be an opportunity for you watching to ask questions. You'll notice that there is a Q&A box just at the bottom of the screen. So if you just write your questions in there, then your host for the evening, Greg Mackling, will get to those as time permits. Now, I don't want to hold things up too much, but I do think it's very important to tell you out of the gate, just how you can get a copy of this book as well. So copies of the series, as well as all of Ken's books, are available from McNally Robinson Booksellers. You can visit us in person, you can give us a call, or you can order the book online. And I'll place that information in the chat in just a moment too. Now, I feel you've all heard more than enough from me, so I'm going to very happily introduce tonight's featured guests. Ken Dryden was a goalie for the Montreal Canadiens in the 1970s, during which time the team won 6 Stanley Cups, and he played for Team Canada in the 1972 Summit Series. He has been inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. He is a former federal minister of parliament, or member of parliament, and cabinet minister, and the author of 8 books, including The Game, Home Game with Roy McGregor, Game Change, and, of course, most recently, Scotty. He and his wife, Linda, live in Toronto and have 2 children and 4 grandchildren. We've had the pleasure of welcoming Mr. Dryden to our store on multiple occasions and are so delighted that he's made the time to join us virtually here tonight to talk about his wonderful new book. We're also delighted that we have proud Winnipegger and lifelong hockey fan, Greg Mackling, here with us tonight to host. Greg has been memorizing and sharing hockey history with anyone who would listen since he was 6 years old. Greg's family history includes a great-grandmother who was once upon a time a season ticket holder for the Montreal Canadiens when the team played at the Forum. A longtime former host of the Sunday morning hockey show and Sports Sunday, Greg is a current member of CJOB's Winnipeg Blue Bomber coverage team. Greg also co-hosts The Start with Brett McGarry, Lauren McNabb, 6 to 10 a.m. weekday mornings on 680 CJOB. Please join me in giving a very warm virtual welcome to Greg Mackling and Ken Dryden.
Thanks so much, John. What a tremendous honor to be with you here tonight. Mr. Dryden, nice to see you again virtually this time. Wonderful to read this book and to get your take on this, because the title of the book is the series, but the subtitle is What I Remember, What It Felt Like, and What It Feels Like Now. And so it's such an intimate look at your perspective of this. And for those at home and those that may not realize, yesterday was in fact the 50th anniversary of Game 3 of this groundbreaking, historic, much celebrated clash between the Soviet national team and Team Canada. One country, the self-proclaimed hockey nation of the planet, the other multiple-time world champion, and I guess depending on who you polled at the time, the underdog in this series. And of course, Ken Dryden was one of 3 goalies who dressed for Team Canada. So Ken, if I may, you may have been viewed by some of the Team Canada brass the same way Canadians viewed the Soviets: accomplished, decorated, but maybe with something left to prove. Is that fair?
I'm not sure that's how it was felt at that time. I had played a couple of years in the NHL. We had won the Stanley Cup the first year, and then had a pretty successful season the second year. We lost out in the playoffs. But I think that if we go back to 1972, and that's what I'm trying to do at this moment, to try to relive the circumstances around 1972, I think that it was pretty much assumed that the 2 goalies for Team Canada would be Tony Esposito and me, and Eddie Johnson, who was a goalie for the Boston Bruins, was also part of the goaltending group. But I think that before the series began, it was assumed that Tony and I would be playing the games.
You tell an interesting story, and I want to get into the Winnipeg game a little bit more specifically for our Prairie audience here in just a moment. But Red Berenson had an interesting comment that you share when it comes to using your skate to prop open the dressing room door. And that's why I kind of went back to that whole idea that maybe there were some in the Team Canada brass that were challenging you a little bit.
No, I mean, I think that you're skipping ahead in the story, actually, Greg. I mean, that the essence of it is really that when the series began, it was assumed that we would win, and we would win all 8 games, and we would win all 8 games decisively. And that wasn't just assumed by us. And we weren't just the self-proclaimed best in the world, that we were the proclaimed best in the world. And that included by the Soviet Union as well. And they had little anticipation of winning the series. I mean, I think that your viewers need to understand that to understand why the series was so compelling, because of the fact that we were the originators, we were the developers, we were the world's best. That through the 1960s, that it was clear that neither the best senior teams in the country nor the Canadian national team, which was based in Winnipeg for part of that time, were going to be good enough to play against the Europeans, most particularly against the Russians, and that Canada, I was on the national team, and when we were based in Winnipeg the last year, and we were supposed to host the World Championships in Winnipeg. And with a dispute with the International Ice Hockey Federation, Canada pulled out, and much to the great anger of people in Winnipeg, who lost that chance to host the World Championships. And so there was a vacuum there for a couple of years of no international hockey whatsoever, and there had been a vacuum forever of Canada's best teams playing against Europe's best. So finally, there is that moment of the series beginning. And so, you know, the setup to the story, you know, of Red Berenson, it really required the first game and the disaster of the first game. And I was the goalie in the game. And so clearly wasn't going to be playing in the second game, and I didn't, and Tony Esposito did and played very well. And so now we're in Winnipeg before game 3. And I'm trying to find a way of, you know, getting my game together. And as the backup goalie now, clearly, I need to get out onto the ice early before practice to help the other players get themselves ready. And what happens, of course, what happens is that I'm getting dressed and I can't find one of my skates. And you know, putting on your goalie skates, if you're a goalie, doesn't exactly come at the end. You know, it comes on kind of midway through the process. And if you can't put your skates on, you can't get the rest of your equipment on. And now I'm going to be late for practice, which is never a good thing, really a bad thing if you're the backup goalie, and triply the bad thing when you're supposed to be out there helping the other players. And I'm trying to figure out where this skate has gone. I can't find it in piles of equipment or anything. And finally I spot it, and it is over at the door to the dressing room. And it's there propping up the door as a doorstop. And I'm trying to, you know, go over nonchalantly so nobody notices and do it calmly and casually. And finally I get there, and Red Berenson, who is on the team, notices that I am, and just sort of, as I'm picking it up and trying to go back to my seat unnoticed entirely, Red just happens to say, "It's the only thing you've stopped all week." Which unfortunately was close to being the truth at that particular moment.
So of course, the series comes to Winnipeg tied at 1 game apiece, and let's talk about the attitude or the atmosphere in Winnipeg, because, you know, all the seats were sold. It was standing room only, maybe the largest crowd that had ever been in the Winnipeg Arena to that point for a hockey game. But you talk about the mixed feelings in Winnipeg at the time. Bobby Hull, of course, had signed with the Jets and the World Hockey Association, but there was an injunction which wasn't allowing him to play for the Jets necessarily, and that took some time to clear up. And of course, he was one of the greatest hockey players on the planet and wasn't playing for Team Canada. So you had that, along with a couple of things that you pointed out. The World Hockey Championships had been scheduled for Winnipeg. The national team had departed. So Winnipeg's relationship with the NHL and Hockey Canada wasn't necessarily rosy at the time.
No, exactly, and for all of those reasons that you have pointed out, and yet, you know, and so there was the disaster of game 1, and then it was kind of the crowd in Toronto was kind of trying to rally us after game 1. But then going into Winnipeg, and so the mood was stabilizing to some extent, and even beginning to be hopeful, because, you know, that we had played well in game 2, but it was and the crowd was very much behind us. I mean, that even in spite of all of the things that were on people's minds from the backdrop that you were describing. You know, we were Team Canada, and so whatever a fan might have felt walking into the arena, as soon as the game begins, we're Team Canada, and there was that kind of support, and we felt it, and we were in control of that game through much of it or most of it, and gave up a couple of shorthanded goals and ended up in a 4-4 tie, which was one of those games where, you know, for the Soviets, it's the tie that felt like a win, and for us, it's the tie that felt like a loss, and so it was still a series that was trying to find its way, try to find a pattern and a path, and that was kind of how we left Winnipeg at that point.
Should Bobby Hull have played in that series, Ken?
It was a series that wasn't sponsored by anybody. That was the thing. I mean, it was this very unusual series where there was no state sponsorship, really. It wasn't the Canadian government that sponsored it. It wasn't the NHL that sponsored it. The NHL really didn't want to have anything to do with it because I think it felt as if it had nothing to gain and perhaps something to lose. And so it was really driven, kind of logistically by the NHL Players Association, but really driven emotionally and in a way in which it was almost willed to happen by the Canadian public. And so with the driver being the NHL Players Association, by that point, not only Bobby Hull, but also Jerry Cheevers, J.C. Tremblay, some others who might have played on the team, having signed with the WHA, they were no longer members of the NHL Players Association, and so they were just kind of not there because of the nature of the organization of the series. And I mean, Bobby Hull obviously would have been a significant player on the team if circumstances had been different.
Your connection to Manitoba, let's talk about that very quickly for those that are joining us that are unaware. If I say Domain, Manitoba, can you give us a couple of minutes on what that town in Manitoba means to the Dryden family history?
Well, it means a lot. That's where my father was born, and our family came from Scotland in 1834, and then and to the area which is now around Cambridge, Ontario. But somewhere around, and I'm not sure exactly the years, but somewhere around 1870, about the point that Manitoba became a province, is that one member of the family moved from the Cambridge area to Domain. And that would have been, I think, that would have been my father's grandfather who moved there. And then my grandfather was born, and my father was born in 1911 in Domain. And he was the oldest of 8 kids. And he stayed on the farm until 1929, when he moved into Winnipeg for a year as a salesman. And that didn't work out very well. And it was just the start of the Depression, the early year of the Depression. And then he kind of rode the rails east to I think he was heading for Toronto, but he ended up in Hamilton. But our family, one of my cousins still farms the family farm, and a couple of others still live in the area. One of the things that was really fun was that when I was playing in the NHL, that the tradition of a player on a Stanley Cup winning team getting the cup for a day during the summer hadn't started. It didn't start until the mid-90s. And of course, the great stories after that, and of people where they would bring the cup to and back to their hometowns. And I always fantasized about, if I had ever had my chance, where would I go? What would I do with it? How would I want to spend my day? With whom would I want to spend it? And I had in mind 2 parts of the day. One was at our childhood home in Etobicoke, a suburb of Toronto, where our parents had paved our backyard, and all the backyard games in the neighborhood, that's where they took place. And so what I was hoping for, I mean, again, in my imagination, because I wasn't going to have my day with the cup, but it would be one last game there, because the pavement was still there, and we still had the nets from all those years. And so it would be to ask the original players and their kids and grandkids to come back for a game. I had a part of the day imagining going to the local rink, where I played minor hockey all the way through for Humber Valley. But then the third part of the day, I couldn't figure out. And then finally, it was like, even though the cup now goes to all of these small towns everywhere in the world, some towns are going to be too small to ever have somebody who plays in the NHL, let alone wins a cup. So is there a place in my life where, in fact, there is such a town? Yes, there is. It's Domain. And so then in 2011, through talking with the Hockey Hall of Fame and everything, they said, okay, you can have your day with the cup. And I thought, oh, wow, fantastic. And so I know exactly what I'm going to do, but it's going to be a little bit complicated, because there needs to be some travel time in it. And so they said, fine, you can do it on a Friday night and then on a Saturday. And so as it turned out, the Saturday morning was the ball hockey game. And we did have all the return of the players, and had one net from the originals and one net from the final game of the Montreal Forum. Those were our nets.
Wow.
We had Michael Burgess that when I had known him a little bit, and said, Michael, if we're going to have a game like this, we need an anthem singer. So he came and sang the anthem. We got the organist for the Leafs to have his little portable keyboard, playing, and we had the cup. And so that was fantastic. The afternoon, it was down at the local rink. The night before, we were in Domain. And so my sister came from Victoria, my brother and I from Toronto, and in Domain, population about 70 or so, there were about 700 people in the local rink. And the totally coincidental part of it, totally coincidental, is that the way the dates lined up is that Thursday, October the 6th, was the opening game of the hockey season for the Boston Bruins, who are the defending champions. So they gave up the cup on that day. And so the first day, because Thanksgiving weekend was right ahead, the first really available day to do it was going to be the following Friday, October the 14th. And as I said to the organizers, you won't believe this, but that's my father's birthday. And then I said, you won't believe this even further. And I can't even believe it as I'm saying it. If he was alive, it would be his 100th birthday. And so we were in Domain, his hometown and his birthplace, with the Stanley Cup on that date.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Ken. I know it's a little bit of a divergence from what we're talking about tonight, but I think it's important for the people that have tuned in on the prairies to know that the strength of your connection to these parts. And your dad was a Blue Bomber fan too, wasn't he?
He was. I mean, it's really interesting. My father lived in Winnipeg, or Domain in Winnipeg, for the first 19 years of his life. He never lived outside of Ontario after that. It was Hamilton for a while, and then in Toronto, in Etobicoke. And yet all the rest of his life, he identified himself as a Westerner. He would always say, I'm a Westerner. I'm a Westerner. And his team was the Bombers. And the only problem he ever had was, especially during I guess it was mostly during maybe the late 50s, but into the 60s, when the Bombers were really good and the Tiger Cats were really good. And so that was his other team from the time of those years in Hamilton. And so when they would meet in the Grey Cup, it was always, Dad, what are you going to do? He said, it's the Bombers. It's the Bombers. So he was always a Bombers fan, even a little more than he was a Hamilton fan.
Well, that's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, they inevitably, year after year after year. So let's then move to the game in Vancouver. And I think anybody that's got the book or pays attention or knows about the series knows how that went in Vancouver, and the Phil Esposito rant, if you want, for lack of a better term, on the television. And then you move and you go to Moscow. And I guess the cliche would be really with your backs against the wall to go to Moscow and to do what needs to be done. Now, I know you had a couple of stops along the way, but just talk about going to Moscow. And you did a wonderful job in the book of talking about Red Square and just the historic significance, the political significance of what was going on. And could you have ever imagined being there once upon a time?
Well, I could, because I had played with the national team, and we had played in Moscow and in then Leningrad. So I was a little bit familiar with the Soviet Union. I think I was probably the only player on our team that had played or that had visited the Soviet Union. And again, this is 1972, and in 1972, there weren't a lot of Canadians that even traveled to Europe, let alone behind the Iron Curtain, and let alone to the Soviet Union. And it was sort of understood as this very mysterious place, and haunting, scary, a place you didn't want to be. And so as NHL players, we were very used to sameness. I mean, we would stay at chain hotels. And by that time, oftentimes the most popular chain were Marriott hotels. And so the beds are all the same. The pillows are all the same. The washrooms are the same. The New York cut steaks are the same. The baked potatoes are the same. And players love that. And in part because they're good, and in part because you don't need to think about them. You're not distracted by a bad pillow or a bad meal, when in fact you have a game to focus on. And so all of a sudden now we're at the Intourist Hotel that almost overlooks Red Square, and things are different. And this was before a time even where duvets were popular in North America. But here we've got this bed sheet that doesn't even tuck in. And so, what's all of this about? And breakfast, the buffet is cheese and cold cut meats and black bread and all kinds of things that are just unfamiliar to us and are distracting, and especially distracting, as you described, where we're down 2-1 and 1 game tied. And now we're out of Canada. Now we've got 4 games in Moscow, and we can't afford anything to go wrong, and we can't afford any kind of distraction, like all of these things that are different. And they're with us, of course. And it was really, to me, it's the most vivid memory I have of the series. It's the 3,000 Canadians that traveled to Moscow for those games. And so you have Luzhniki Arena, capacity 14,000, and 11,000 Russian fans, and you've got 3,000 Canadians. And this is before a time of bucket lists, and where you have people that have the means are able to decide that they want to have a special experience and go a special place and do a special thing, and they're able to, and that they just check it off on a list. No, I mean that the vast majority of the Canadians who went, didn't have that kind of privilege. It wasn't that easy for them to go, and yet they were there, and you could sense that they were there in part because of a feeling that they had for hockey, a feeling that they had for Canada, and some combination of the two that they probably didn't even understand themselves. And there they were. And it was an amazing atmosphere in those games. Those fans, 3,000 on the road, that sounded like 30,000. And then one of the classic parts of it, which I've always tried to figure out how it could have begun, but they started a chant. They created their own chant that, instead of, as it would have been for other international games, as they would have been in Winnipeg, it would have been "Go Canada, go! Go Canada, go!" All of a sudden, a few people, and then more, and then everybody, all the Canadian fans are chanting out this "Da Canada, nyet Soviet," and they were just having the time of their lives doing it. And it was a terrific atmosphere for us.
You seem, I'll ask it this way. How cognizant were you of what was going on back home? You know, you list off very precisely the start of game 8, the start times right across the country. How much did the players know about what was going on in Canada in terms of their buy-in for game 8 and how much it was meaning to the people of our country?
Yeah. I don't know that we had enough time to think about it much, and that what would be the reminders were the telegrams that we received. And at that point, a telegram was a big deal for those people who were over the age of 40. And telegrams were really expensive. I mean, this was at a time when phone calls were through the roof in terms of cost. So nobody made international phone calls. Letters took 3 weeks or 4 weeks or so. And so a telegram could get to you within a day, but it would have only 10 words or so. And it would be just a very short little message and a person's name and where they lived. And so we started to receive them, and more and more and more of them. And they would be on a table in the dressing room. And then there were so many of them that the trainers started to put them up on the wall of the corridor leading to our dressing room, and then down one wall, and they were still coming in, so back on the other wall. And players would, before practice or after practice or before games, you just find yourself in the hall and just kind of reading the very simple messages, from, we're behind you, Brandon, Fred Jones, Brandon, Manitoba, whatever. I mean, it didn't matter. It didn't matter what the words were, the name, and you didn't know, but the town, you'd see the names, or, that one of the players, Pat Stapleton, was from Sarnia, and you'd see a telegram from Sarnia and be, hey, Whitey, come over here. Do you know George Anderson, he's from Sarnia? Oh yeah, George. And that sort of thing. I mean, that was all a part of it, and part of the buildup and the excitement of it.
Almost the mail call like you see in World War II movies, yeah. And the notes from home. So I'm curious if what you were playing for heading into game 1 in Montreal and what you were playing for in game 8 at Luzhniki, were those two things slightly different? The motivation?
No, I don't think so. I think the motivation, the preparation was different. But the motivation, no, I don't think so. I mean, certainly what happens as a series goes on, that it gets more and more, in this series in particular, it gets more and more intense, and in that comes about in part because of the closeness, the competitiveness of it, the clear stakes of the series. All of that, builds towards the 8th game. But in terms of our awareness, if we had stopped to think, we would have known that there would have been, huge numbers of people watching. I mean, one of the things that was fun in writing the book and the part that you mentioned was, again, trying to recreate the moment. And that's what I try to do in this series. I mean, if you're going to understand it at all, it's the only way you can is if you're actually trying to relive it moment by moment in real time at that time. And that's, done all very purposely. So now we get to game 8, in it. And it's easy to say, the country stopped, the country stood still. Well, that's an easy phrase. What does that mean? Well, what it meant in this case was that this was a game that was played on a Thursday, and it was played. It started at 8:00 Moscow time. That meant it started at 1:30 in the afternoon in St. John's, at 1:00 in Halifax, at noon in Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto, at 11 in the morning in Winnipeg, at 10 in the morning in Calgary and Edmonton, at 9 in the morning in Vancouver and Victoria and in Whitehorse. So it was, and the whole game was played during the work hours and school hours, the whole game right across the country. And in spite of all of that, on a Thursday, and the population of Canada at the time, 22 million. The number of people who watched, 16 million. I mean, just bizarre. I mean, just something that that's what a country that is standing still and has stopped. That's what that means, and that's part of that one of the big. It's evidence of, but it's also part of the question and the challenges is to try to understand that. I mean, what is it that could make that percentage of the Canadian population decide to share an experience like that? Why? Nothing else.
Only one thing.
Come close. Yeah.
Only one thing.
Yeah. And so, and not only one thing, but one moment. That the 87 Canada Cup or the 2010 Olympics, not even close to those percentages. And so what is it about? And that's what I try to get and try to answer in this book. And that's what makes that moment and that series different from other great series that may have had greater players, playing in it, but that it's like telling a joke. You've got the punchline and you got the story. You only deliver the punchline. Canada stood still. Big deal. It's what's the story that leads up to the punchline. That's what delivers the punch. And that series had a huge punchline, or had a huge story leading to the punchline.
So much of the story talks about overcoming the changes, the differences. As a goaltender, you go through the difference of playing on the international ice and your reference points on the ice. And so that was different. But you also talk about modifying your game a little bit. One of our viewers talking about, Vladislav Tretiak, which was, this event was a coming out party for him. I think we'd all agree. Can you touch on your respect for Vladislav Tretiak, but also maybe what you may have learned from him, what you may have learned from Tony Esposito throughout the time of the Summit Series?
Well, I think, it was a coming out party for Tretiak, and I think he was 20 years old at the time, and Russian goalies historically had been good, but not better than good. And that they probably weren't as good relatively as their defensemen were, as their forwards were. And Tretiak, before the series began, and because he was as young as he was and as unknown as he was, the assumption was that Soviet goaltending in general was a weakness, and chances are it would be even greater weakness with him as the goalie. And as it turned out, that wasn't it. He played very well, and because he was expected to play poorly and did play very well, it seemed as if he was played even better than that. But he was very good, and it was his launch pad. That from that moment he just got better and better through the 1970s. In terms of it wasn't so much learning from either Tony or from Vladik. It was more just learning the circumstances or appreciating the circumstances of a different style of play and having to find your own answer in it. We were talking earlier about Bobby Hull. There was nobody who personified the style of the 1960s more than Bobby Hull. He's a left winger and with a big, powerful shot, and with a hook blade, and could just blast the puck. And others wanted to be like Bobby Hull. And our style of game was that you headman the puck, you get it to that winger that is breaking down the wing, and then they'll blast it, from there. And as goalies, we had decent equipment, but it wasn't fabulous. And it certainly wasn't remotely as big as it is now. And with a puck moving that fast, you don't have enough time to move the distance that you have to move in order to stop it if it's going into a corner. And so the only way you could really play successfully against that is move out, cut the angle, as the phrase would go. So we went out and cut the angle, which is all great if you're focusing on somebody who is going to shoot and from the wing. But what happens when that player coming down the wing decides that they want to pass laterally to a teammate? Well, you're stuck out there in no man's land if you're a goalie, and the guy who's receiving the pass, he's got a whole open net. And so in kind of the parlance of today, that I was playing a north-south game and they were playing an east-west game. And I had to find a way of swapping my instincts, changing it. And so not to move out as nearly as much and move more side to side. And so that was the challenge of it. And of course, it's a challenge in real time. I mean, you've got to defeat those instincts. You've got to unlearn what you've learned, and you've got to do it by tomorrow, because the next game is coming to tomorrow. And the question was, can you do it in time?
Yeah, of course, time was of the essence, and you didn't have Roger Nielsen breaking down the video or anything like that. It was all based on lived experience. So before we get to sort of the culmination of the series, and some great questions here, and Ken, of course, we never have enough time to go through them all. But how much did you start to dislike one another? How much did the players begin to really not like each other very much? And did it take very long?
Probably didn't take that long. And I mean, I think that I mean, you'd have to ask individual players, but I mean, the Stanley Cup playoff series, I mean, when you're playing somebody again and again, is that there's an accumulation of feeling that happens. I mean, that the slash that you took last night, gets added to the slash that you got 2 games before, and so those feelings build, and they build with the kind of tension and emotions and sense of what was at stake, in the series. And so, I mean, one of the things that I talk about in the book is how that I mean, I have kind of a visual image that remains, but even more than that, it's as if it was this gigantic scream that it started with a scream, and then it just got louder. I mean, and it just a scream of energy, a scream of emotion, a scream of things happening, of weird things happening, of things that you've never seen before, of feelings that you've never had before. And all of that building and building and building, and then building up, to the 8th game. And also what was happening, and different than any other series that I've ever been involved in, and I think it would be the same for others, is that there was never a moment that you could predict what the next moment was going to be. I mean, playoff series always kind of, change from game to game. You try to change them if you're not doing well, during game, but from game to game, you adapt. You change your lineup a little bit, you would change your approach, your strategy a little bit differently, and make it a little bit different. And so oftentimes you get to at a certain point in the series, and where it starts to become the result is still unpredictable, but how you're going to get to the result becomes more predictable. I mean, you find your game, they find their game, theirs, they know yours, and it's just a matter of who's going to win in the end. That never happened in this series. That as much as you would adapt, the next moment would be something that you weren't ready for, and then it would lead to another moment that you weren't ready for. And it's in those kinds of predictable moments where emotions can kind of settle down a little bit. Well, there never were those predictable moments. So every next thing that happened, would kind of strike you and give you and be a jolt, and again raise those emotions even higher, and such that in the eighth game, and especially I think it was in the second period, where things just all seemed to let loose, but that and part of it again is just that feeling towards your opponent. I mean, the interesting thing after is that you once those immediate moments start to dissipate and the series is over, what happens over time is that gradually and more you end up having the time and the opportunity to feel respect, and that's what the ongoing feeling is. I mean, there is an immense amount of respect that that is there in the Russian players for Canadian players and Canadian players for Russian players that didn't have much of a chance to exhibit itself while the series was going on.
So if you think about the Miracle on Ice in 1980 with the USA team, Jim Craig was all over the media for months and weeks and maybe even years afterward. You could, he parlayed his role in USA's victory over the Soviets into an NHL contract. Everybody knows where they were if they were watching the game. The whole Paul Henderson goal, 34 seconds left, the elation. We have video of that. What was Ken Dryden doing when that puck went in the net and you realized the go-ahead goal had been scored?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I was 180 feet away and watching as others were watching, and all that far away, and those who have seen video of the goal, there was a scramble, and 180 feet away, you can't really make out what's happening. All you know is you can see 3 or 4 players, and you can see sticks move, and you can see Tretiak on his back, but you don't know how it's going to play out. And I don't know whether I saw Henderson's arms go in the air first or I saw the red light go on first. I don't know. But at some moment, it was clear that the puck went in. And then the only thing that I remember, after that, I don't remember the moment that it went in. I remember myself at center ice. And how I got from my crease to center ice, I know how, but I don't remember the moments of it. But I'm at center ice and I'm skating as fast as I can, which isn't very fast, and in my goalie skates. And what I can still hear in my head are 2 things. I can hear the clomp, clomp, clomp of the big goalie skates with the wide blades hitting the ice, and I can hear my own kind of whoops in my own ears as I'm going up the ice. And then I can remember myself kind of in the scrum of celebration, and then in the midst of that, I can remember myself, and as if I've just, like a scene from a movie, I've slapped myself in the face and saying, "Wait a minute, get a hold of yourself. There's still 34 seconds to go," and of trying to bring myself back down, and heading back to that. And then I don't recollect, anything after that. But it was. I do remember the moment at which it ended, but those last 34 seconds, basically nothing at all.
Different personalities in the room. So I'm going to combine a couple of different questions here, if I can, from our viewers here. And that's other than obviously Phil Esposito was the leader that the Canadian people saw. Espo was clearly the spokesperson for the team to a great extent. He was the conduit between the team and the public in a lot of circumstances. Who were the other leaders in that dressing room? And were there, one of our viewers saying here, had you heard Tony Esposito say that he would kill the Russians, the Soviets to win that series? Were there varying degrees of vitriol amongst your teammates?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there were too many varying degrees. I think that each player is different in how he expresses it, and so, you know, I'm not sure those were Tony's words. I've heard, I think Phil quoted that way. I mean, that's how Phil talks. I mean, that's how, you know, I mean, you know, that he's a very passionate guy, and his passions get expressed that way. And others maybe just as passionate, but they express themselves differently. And one of the things that was interesting about that series is that you when you put a team together, and especially a team like this that was made up of all kinds of all-stars and multiple trophy winners and the high, you know, top scorers in the league, and often they were captains of their team. So who is going to emerge among all of these leaders as the leader, or as one of a couple of leaders? And you never know that. You can never predict that. And so and you're right in saying, you know, that Phil became the leader, and it was because of Phil being Phil, what he did, his personality. Nobody said to him, you know, Phil, you go out and be the spokesperson and this and that. No, I mean, you know, that you know, the fans could sense it, the players could sense it, the media sensed it. You know, when you come into a dressing room and you're asking questions of the players, you go to the person who scored the goal. You always go to the goalie to hear you know, how the goals went in, and you go to the team leader or leaders. And so Phil, you know, would be front and center in it. But you never, you know, quite know who's going to be that kind of driving force. And people like, you know, Bobby Clark. I mean, Bobby Clark was a young guy, you know, at that point. But Bobby is that kind of emotional leader as well. I mean, he, not in what he says, but in what he does, in that kind of doggedness, in the way in which he plays. You know, that Paul Henderson, I mean, in scoring winning goals in the last 3 games. You know, that Pat Stapleton and Bill White, you know, they were an outstanding defense pairing. That they may have been the best defense pairing in the NHL for 3 or 4 years. Bobby Orr and Dallas Smith may have been better, but it was more because of the greatness of Bobby Orr than the kind of partnership that it would have been with Dallas Smith. And so here are Bill White and Pat Stapleton. And Pat Stapleton, this short guy who was always considered too short to be a defenseman in the NHL, who just totally relentlessly and with determination forced his way into the league, and then to become an important player in this series. So people have their own ways of expressing their competitiveness, of having an effect on their teammates, and it plays out in, again, ways that you're never quite sure what they're going to be.
Would you believe, Ken, I have as a gift, my dad gave this to me a little while ago.
Oh,
this is a Valery Harlamov game used stick.
Yeah.
Came straight from Russia in 1986.
Oh, wow.
One of my most cherished possessions.
I can imagine.
And of course, European hockey is a big deal in these parts. Anders Hedberg, Ulf Nielsen, Lars-Erik Sjöberg, and then of course Teemu Selanne and Patrick Laine. Since a whole long list of European players. Was the Summit Series? Did it open the doors? I know the trickling of European players had somewhat started, but did that make it a little bit more viable long term? Were teams going all of a sudden now? I'm probably not going after any Soviet players, but we could sense maybe that the game is going to change, and the Jets certainly led the way in changing the way the game was played.
Yeah, no, I mean it was in some ways it's opening the doors, but even ahead of opening the doors, it's opening the minds. That's what has to open first before you're willing to open the door. And again, going back to the beginnings of our conversation, again, this is 1972, and the best in the world is Canada. And the understanding is if you're the best in the world, you must do things the best way. And so the way you play, the style of game, the way we would play all kinds of games and only practice occasionally, that must be the best way because we're the best. And the fact that the Russians were different is interesting, but different only matters if you're really good. And they were really good against other amateur teams. They had not shown that they were really good against the best, against us. And so going into that series, it was, they play the wrong way. And it's why this series was really not only the most important set of games in Canadian hockey history, but in all of international hockey history, because it opened the mind. It opened the mind to the possibility that there was another way to play. And once you understand or come to realize that there's another way to play, then there's a third way to play, and a fifth, and an eighth, and a 10th way to play. And coaches that had always been questioning certain things about the way in which our game was played, they felt as if they had a right now to question it. Players who might have played differently felt as if they had a right to think about playing their position differently. And it was fairly slow during the 1970s. But by the 1980s, it was starting to pick up. And the challenge was that in North America, there were two different worlds in terms of the coaches. There were the NHL coaches, and there were the college coaches. And the college coaches had no status at all amongst the NHL coaches or amongst the NHL. They were college coaches. So they may think these different thoughts, but they're only college coaches. I mean, it really took coaches like Scotty Bowman or Fred Sherrill to talk in terms of and start to implement some other ways of doing things. And then, of course, in the 1980s, I mean, Gretzky was really a product of that, of the 72 series. I mean, he was the most Russian in his style of play of all Canadian players. I mean, he was somebody who moved the puck. He's somebody who would move it and get it back and bring, his four teammates with him, up the ice. I mean, the interesting part in the last, 10, 15 years now is Alex Ovechkin. I mean, he's the embodiment of the mix of the Canadian style and of the European style. I mean, he's this guy who can score like crazy and is tough and plays in the tough parts of the ice. But what this series did, and what nothing else could and wouldn't have for some period of time, is opened the mind to the idea that it was possible to play at the top in a different way.
I just want to read Frank's text before we jump off here, Ken, because I think it speaks to what so many Canadians remember about the series. The specifics are going to be different for everyone, but Frank says, just a great memory for me. Game one was on September 2nd, my 13th birthday. My mom and dad didn't have a lot of money, but they won the ticket lottery to buy 2 tickets in Winnipeg. I think it was $50. Not sure about the price, but it was expensive for us. That was the first time I saw NHLers. So just a great nostalgic moment for me going with my dad, and a big thank you to you, Ken, and for winning this. And that comes from Frank Berard. And I think Frank speaks on behalf of millions of Canadians. Thank you for the memories. Thank you for sharing it this way in this new book, because it's a unique way to tell the story, and could never get enough time with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks very much. And thanks everybody for tuning in. And I just leave one last word about McNally Robinson. And I hope you know, in Saskatoon and in Winnipeg, how terrific a bookstore it is. I mean, I've been in a lot of bookstores across the country, and McNally Robinson is just terrific. And I'm glad to have done this virtually tonight, and I look forward to the next time I'm actually in the bookstores and doing a similar conversation, but doing it in person. But thanks a lot tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. That means an awful lot. And we're so very grateful that you took this time to be with us here tonight and speak so deeply and intriguingly and just in such a detailed fashion on the series, and just for taking the time to share your memories with us as well. It was a really rich conversation. And so we're so grateful to you, and so grateful to Greg for shepherding the whole conversation along, and to all of you for your incredible memories, your questions, and some of your comments. Rest assured, even if we didn't get to your question, I'll be sure to share them with the folks involved in the event, just so they can see the level of engagement that took place tonight. I won't belabor the point much more, other than just to bask in what we just watched. So thank you so very much, Ken. Thank you, Greg. Thank you to my colleagues in Saskatoon as well for helping to spread the word around this event. And of course, to McClelland Stewart and Penguin Random House for publishing this book in the first place. If you haven't got your hands on a copy of the series just yet, I'd highly recommend it. It's visually sumptuous. It's really fascinating. And it's just a close first-hand look at an incredibly important historic event, both in general and in sports history. And of course, Ken's written a few other books, so please do feel free to stop by the store and pick up any of those as well. So thank you all for joining us here tonight. If you'd like to revisit this conversation at any point, it'll remain live on YouTube, so please do avail yourself of the video. But otherwise, very good night to you all, and much gratitude for